Smoke did rise over Viking funerals, but not always from burning ships. Some bodies were buried whole beneath towering mounds. Others were reduced to ash and sealed in humble urns. The rituals varied wildly, between regions, between clans, even between neighbors. And buried beneath one of those mounds was a secret that would rewrite Viking history. These weren't simple, uniform rituals. Across pre-Christian Scandinavia and the places the Norse settled, burial practices were incredibly diverse. There were many different ways of burying the dead, and different communities seem to have had their own preferred methods. They didn't even agree on what to do with the body. In some areas, cremation was favored. The body was burned, and ashes placed in the graves. In others, inhumation was the norm. The body was buried intact. This lack of consistency even puzzled people at the time. Medieval Christian authors, used to rigid funerary practices, found it strange and objectionable. The Icelandic author Snorri Sturluson, writing in the S, suggested that funeral pyres were the earliest practice, part of an age of burning, with a cairn of stones raised over the ashes, later replaced by a preference for burial mounds. However, archaeological evidence does not suggest that the reality was anywhere near this straightforward. Perhaps the most recognizable feature seen across the Viking world is the burial mound. There are thousands strewn throughout Scandinavia and beyond, in the places the Norse settled. But even mounds weren't uniform. They varied dramatically in size. They range from barely noticeable bumps, often only found now by aerial photography, to giants close to meters tall and meters in diameter, like the North Mound at Jelling. Other large Viking Age mounds include those at Borre in Norway, reaching heights of meters and diameters of meters, while even larger mounds exist in Scandinavia, like Anundshög in Sweden or Raknehaugen in Norway. These are likely to predate the Viking Age. The vast majority of mounds were far more diminutive and have decreased in height over time. The size of a mound wasn't just about aesthetics. It reflected the power of the person who commissioned it. Building a massive mound required a huge number of people to share the burden of labor, showing the influence of the person who could command so many. Mounds like those at Borre, Jelling, or Gamla Uppsala in Sweden must have required huge numbers of people to construct them. And what was under the mound? It wasn't always the same thing. The mound itself amounted to the icing on the cake. Some covered simple stone boxes containing remains, cyst burials, which often contained the burnt remains of the deceased. Others were raised over chamber graves, which was typically the case for burials at Birka in Sweden. And yes, some were erected over entire buried ships. The association between Viking Age burials and ships is strong, and for good reason, but it wasn't usually the flaming kind. Ships were associated with the journey to the afterlife, providing the deceased a vessel for their final voyage across the metaphorical sea of death. This association between boats and the journey to the afterlife is a common motif found throughout folklore all over the world, as the sea, seemingly endless, mysterious, and dangerous, naturally lends itself to an association with death and the beyond. That famous image of a flaming ship burial, like the one described by the 10th century Arabic writer Ibn Fadlan, who observed the funeral of a chieftain of the Volga Vikings, or in the myth of the god Balder. While dramatic, there's very little archaeological evidence for this practice. Ibn Fadlan described the chieftain's body being placed in a boat drawn up on land, surrounded with goods, a human sacrifice carried out, and then the entire boat being burned. However, with the evidence being burned, it is hard to verify if this was a genuine Norse practice, and there is no other evidence for it. It seems to be more of a literary or mythical idea than a widespread practice. Instead, plenty of archaeological evidence exists for buried boats covered by mounds, where the deceased was placed in the boat. The most famous examples are the Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials in Norway. The Oseberg ship, meters long, had seen decades of service and was undoubtedly highly valuable to the community that was prepared to part with it for this burial. Another boat burial was recently discovered by scans of a burial mound at Viksletta in Norway. Burning and burying real boats were not the only way to introduce boat imagery into funerary rites. Perhaps even more common were ship settings, outlines of ships created using large stones. Often these ship settings were small. One cemetery at Lindholm Høje in Denmark contains as many as burials marked by small ship settings of meters in length. Other ship settings are far larger. The largest was at Jelling and measured some meters from end to end. Sweden has also yielded a series of huge ship settings at Anundshög, Ale Steinar, and Oseberg. Viking ships were even designed with navigation in mind, sitting low in the water, and were highly maneuverable, designed to be pulled onto beaches and carried across land if necessary, remaining operational even when other ships were trapped in ice. Rich pre-Christian burials often contain an array of objects known as burial goods. These weren't random items. They might have been things of personal importance to the deceased or their family, items which symbolize the social role of the deceased in life, or equipment that would assist them in the afterlife, or a combination of these reasons. These items would be positioned around the remains in a burial chamber. Many Viking burials consisted only of a chamber, often with a mound raised over it, while in boat burials the shape of the boat created a convenient chamber. For vast boat burials such as the Oseberg ship, wooden burial chambers were erected on the deck of the boat. Take the incredible Oseberg ship burial. It had a truly huge grave assemblage, a testament to the importance of its 2 female occupants. Many of the items had a seemingly everyday function, such as a bed upon which the bodies were placed, buckets, and sleds, although they were all highly decorated. There were textiles, including wool garments and imported silks, and elaborate tapestries which appeared to depict scenes from Norse mythology. A particularly notable feature was an elaborate cart that was clearly built only to go into the grave, as it could only move in a straight line. The burial also contained bedding filled with fine feathers and down, as well as oil lamps and large quantities of ordinary household utensils, like cooking pots, frying pans, buckets, and knives. These household items tell us about the woman's role in society. Besides this, the Oseberg ship contained a large number of animal bodies, horses, an ox, and 3 dogs. Animal sacrifices are a common feature of Viking-age Scandinavian burials. Dogs and horses are found particularly often. Dogs were associated with hunting. Horses were associated with elite warfare, and a large number of graves which contain military equipment also contain the body of a horse. These are often referred to as equestrian graves, borrowing a Roman term. Dogs were important companions and protectors, and were treasured so much that they were often buried with their owners. The 4 dogs found at Oseberg showed the importance of pets, even in the afterlife. Beyond animals and large items, Viking burials, especially those of women, contained significant amounts of jewelry. Jewelry was worn by both sexes and could be fashioned from precious metals like silver and gold for the upper class, or from base materials like tin, lead, iron, and possibly copper for the lower class. Brooches were particularly common and can be called obligatory jewelry, as they had a function in costumes as fasteners. Many types of brooches have been found, from individual precious items to mass-produced ones, sometimes gilded. Domed oval brooches used by women to fasten their dresses are the most common, worn in pairs and often decorated with bold relief and gripping beast ornaments. Brooches often worn on the shoulders helped hold women's dresses in place and dictated how the dress draped the figure. From these brooches, women might hang textile implements like scissors, tweezers, and awl, or a needle case on straps. Between the brooches, festoons of beads, sometimes with amber or silver pendants, might be suspended. Necklaces were favored by women, often made of polished beads, gemstones, silver, or gold. Men's neckwear was often simpler, sometimes glass beads surrounding an amulet, such as the most popular pendant of all, Thor's hammer Mjolnir. The Thor's hammer pendant was understood as a protective amulet and a source of personal strength. Other pendants honored the gods and could take forms like a throne, Odin's steed Sleipnir, or weapons associated with deities. Arm rings and armbands were worn by both sexes, but held ceremonial and social significance. The Norse arm ring was essentially a wallet, designed to be easily bent so a piece could be broken off for trade. It also served to mark a boy's transition to a man, or as a gift from someone of higher social status to a subordinate, like the figure of King Hrothgar in Beowulf, known as a ring giver. Finger and toe rings were also worn. Headpieces were also common for both sexes, including peaked hats, close-fitting wool caps, and metal fillets, often serving to keep hair in place. Married women might also wear a tall headdress or a scarf around their hair. The famous horned helmet is likely a Christian construct or used only in ceremony, as real Viking helmets had no horns or wings, which would have been impractical in battle. Clothing itself was made of wool, linen, and animal hides, and for the wealthy, silk. Vikings used layering, typically wearing 3 to 5 layers. A linen-based layer was worn against the skin, wicking moisture away. On top of this came layers of wool, possibly with a leather outer layer. Tunics were common, often knee-length, worn with trousers. Cloaks were also worn, some upper-class cloaks being fur-lined or bordered with silk, or embroidered with gold or silver thread. Fragments of special shaggy cloaks have been found, with an outer surface combed to create a fur-like texture, allowing water to bead up. Hats were fitted caps covering the ears. Mittens were used for hands, keeping fingers together for warmth, often lined with fur and possibly waterproofed with animal fat Textiles have been preserved through contact with metal objects in graves, providing information about the types of fabric used and clues about clothing design and cuts based on brooch placement. Viking clothing had to perform in cold conditions. Except for slaves, Scandinavians were generally well-dressed and took great pride in their personal appearance. Thralls wore only a woolen knee-length tunic. While weapons are often highlighted in discussions of Viking graves, graves more commonly contain implements related to grooming, such as tweezers, combs, toothpicks, and washing bowls. Combs were carried by almost every Viking, carved from antler, bone, ivory, and wood, often kept in their own cases. This supports other evidence that Vikings took personal hygiene and appearance seriously. They began each morning with a hygiene regimen, and Saturday was set aside for bathing and washing clothes. Christian chroniclers noted and criticized these habits, seeing them as vain posturing. They suggested Viking raids were God's punishment for Christians emulating this pagan self-care. John of Wallingford, a 5th century chronicler, famously justified the massacre of Danes by noting they made themselves acceptable to English women by their elegant manners and care of person. Combing hair daily, bathing Saturday, changing garments often, which allowed them to seduce women. For Vikings, maintaining appearance was important, reflecting a cultural value. It was tied to the concept of fate. Since one never knew when they might die, they should always look their best for the afterlife. Norse poetry, like the Havamal and Reginsmal, explicitly advised being combed and washed daily, and not being ashamed of one's clothing or appearance. Personal grooming also had cosmic significance. Not trimming one's nails contributed to the building of the ship Naglfar, made from the nails of the dead, which would sail at Ragnarok, bringing the world closer to its end. Vikings saw Christians as savages who failed to grasp the importance of bathing and looking one's best. Traditionally, scholars used grave goods to try and identify the deceased based solely on these items. Graves with metalwork tools like hammers, tongs, and crucibles were called smiths' graves, largely accepted for deceased smiths, although some argue they were status symbols, as many smith graves also contain high-status weaponry. Graves with weapons like swords, spears, and shields were often called male or warrior graves. Those with jewelry associated with female clothing, beads, household items like weaving looms, and textiles were typically labeled female graves. Warrior graves often included the corpses of horses, sets of weapons, and sometimes gaming pieces and boards. The larger the number of weapons in a grave, the more high status it was assumed to be. An oft-quoted example of a quintessential warrior grave is one from Birka in Sweden, which contained a sword, spear, axe, knife, bow and arrow, 2 shields, and 2 horses. Yet this grave also contained a surprise for archaeologists. So what can we learn from these practices? Firstly, most well-documented practices are associated with the richer members of society, whose families could afford a lavish send-off. The burial traditions of the lower classes are largely unknown to us, but beyond just showing wealth, burials reveal relative wealth and status. The nature of a burial can tell us about the social standing of those who commissioned it. A larger mound meant a greater number of individual hours of labor, and therefore more people required to share the burden, reflecting the influence of the commissioner. More weapons in a warrior grave often meant higher status. Parting with a valuable ship like Oseberg, which had seen decades of service, shows immense wealth and value to the community. Burials also inform us about religion. Christian burials were typically much smaller and simpler, rarely containing goods or large monuments, although some may have been associated with rune stones. However, there's a fascinating complexity. Does the religious affiliation indicated by a burial reflect the religion of the person who was buried, or the person who buried them? It is possible that someone could convert to Christianity, but their offspring remained pagan, and thus buried them in a pagan fashion. Alternatively, Christian offspring could bury their pagan parents in a Christian fashion. This occurred with Harold Bluetooth, who converted to Christianity. He disinterred his pagan father, King Gorm, from his burial mound at Jelling, and reburied him in a Christian church. The North Mound at Jelling, thought to cover King Gorm's burial, and the Jelling rune stone, which commemorates Gorm, both clearly express the power of Harold Bluetooth. This issue of who is being represented has broader implications than simply religion. Although we might assume that burials reflect the wealth and power of the person who was buried, in reality, they are just as likely to reflect the wealth and power of the person who commissioned the burial, be they the spouse or children of the deceased. By commissioning a lavish burial for their predecessors, chieftains or kings could make a statement about their own power, asserting the fact that they had inherited the wealth and status of their forebears. Again, Jelling provides a prime example of this assertion of inherited power through monumental burial. So Viking burial practices were far from uniform. They ranged from simple cremations to elaborate ship burials under massive mounds, filled with goods that tell us about the deceased's life, status, and beliefs. General theme: they show a society that valued status, personal appearance, and was deeply connected to symbols like ships and mounds. And crucially, they remind us that what we see in the ground might say as much about the living as the dead.